The worst lies are the ones told with a calm voice. Imagine a mother standing in front of cameras, begging the world for help. Her voice shakes. Her eyes fill with tears. She says her little boy is missing. She says she has no idea where he is. She says she just wants her child back. Police begin searching forests. Volunteers hand out flyers. News stations repeat the story over and over. But something about the mother feels wrong. Investigators notice it first. Small details, strange answers, a timeline that does not quite make sense. And then slowly, piece by piece, the horrifying truth begins to surface. The woman asking the world to find her son is the same woman who killed him. This is the disturbing case of Susan Smith, a mother whose performance almost fooled everyone, but not for long. The year was 1994, in the quiet town of Union, South Carolina. It was the kind of place where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked. Families knew each other. Children played outside without fear. In this peaceful community lived Susan Smith, a young mother with two little boys. Her sons were 3-year-old Michael Smith and 14-month-old Alexander Smith. To neighbors, Susan seemed like a struggling but loving parent. She worked a regular job and was raising 2 toddlers largely on her own after separating from her husband, David Smith. No one in the town suspected that the woman they greeted at the grocery store was quietly unraveling. On the evening of October 25, 1994, Susan Smith walked into the Union police station and reported something terrifying. She said a man had carjacked her. According to her story, a black man had jumped into her car while she was stopped at a red light. He had a gun. He forced her out of the vehicle. Then he drove away with her 2 little boys still strapped into their car seats. It was the kind of nightmare every parent fears. And Susan Smith told it with heartbreaking emotion. She cried in interviews. She pleaded with the supposed kidnapper to bring her children home safely. Television stations broadcast her appeal nationwide. At one point, she looked directly into the camera and spoke as if the man responsible might be watching. Her voice trembled as she said she loved her boys and just wanted them back. Millions of people believed her. The story exploded across the United States. The FBI joined the investigation. Police officers searched roads, lakes, forests, and abandoned buildings. For 9 days, the country watched the case unfold. People prayed for Michael and Alex. But behind the scenes, investigators were beginning to feel uneasy. Some of Susan Smith's statements were inconsistent. The timeline she provided kept shifting slightly each time she retold the story. Police also noticed something else. When parents lose children in violent kidnappings, their behavior is often chaotic and desperate. But Susan sometimes seemed oddly controlled. Still, investigators had no proof that she was lying, so they kept digging. During the search, one detective began looking closely at the location where Susan claimed the carjacking happened. The intersection was quiet. There were no witnesses who had seen anything. No one had seen a man with a gun. No one had seen a car speeding away. And that raised the first major red flag. As days passed, pressure on Susan increased. Investigators asked her to repeat her story again and again. Each time they looked for cracks, and slowly, those cracks started to widen. Another disturbing problem emerged. The entire case was built on Susan's description of an unknown black suspect. This claim led police to stop and question several innocent black men in the area. The community began to feel tension and fear, but investigators could not ignore the possibility that the suspect might exist. Meanwhile, Susan continued appearing on television. She held press conferences. She cried. She begged for her children's safe return. Watching those interviews today is chilling, because the truth is that the boys were already dead. They had been dead since the very night Susan reported them missing, and the person responsible was standing right in front of the cameras. Here is where the story becomes even darker. In the weeks before the crime, Susan Smith had been having an affair with a man named Tom Finley. Tom Finley was wealthy and came from a prominent local family. But there was one problem. According to investigators, Tom had written Susan a letter explaining that he was not ready to become involved with a woman who already had 2 kids. For Susan, that rejection hit hard. She was desperate to keep the relationship alive. Investigators later believed that this obsession played a major role in what happened next. On the night of October 25th, Susan drove her car toward John D. Long Lake, a quiet and dark lake outside town. Inside the vehicle were Michael and Alex, strapped safely into their car seats. They trusted their mother completely. What happened next is almost impossible to comprehend. Police later determined that Susan Smith put the car in neutral and allowed it to roll down a boat ramp into the water. Her 2 sons were still inside. The vehicle slowly sank into the lake. The boys drowned while trapped in their seats, and then Susan drove away. Instead of reporting what she had done, she created the carjacking story. For 9 days, she maintained the lie, but the truth was closing in. Investigators had begun questioning her more aggressively. The timeline problems were piling up. Polygraph examinations increased the pressure. Finally, during an intense interrogation on November 3, 1994, Susan Smith broke. She confessed. In tears, she told investigators that there had been no carjacker. There had been no gun. There had only been her. The confession stunned the entire nation. Rescue teams immediately returned to John D. Long Lake and began searching the water. Soon they found the car. Inside were the bodies of Michael and Alex, still strapped into their car seats. The discovery confirmed the horrifying truth. The mother who had cried on national television had killed her own children. When news of the confession spread, the public reaction was explosive. People who had prayed for Susan Smith now felt betrayed and furious. Her case quickly became one of the most infamous crimes in modern American history. The trial began in 1995. Prosecutors described the drowning of Michael and Alex in heartbreaking detail. They argued that Susan murdered her children because she believed they stood in the way of her romantic relationship with Tom Finley. The defense did not deny that she caused their deaths. Instead, they attempted to portray Susan as mentally unstable and emotionally fragile. Her attorneys presented evidence of her troubled childhood, depression, and history of suicide attempts. They argued that she had not been thinking clearly, but the prosecution focused on the deliberate nature of the crime. Susan had driven to the lake. She had allowed the car to roll into the water, and then she had spent 9 days lying to the entire country. Perhaps the most disturbing evidence was the video of her television pleas for help. Jurors watched as she begged the supposed kidnapper to return her boys. Knowing what they knew, the footage was chilling. After weeks of testimony, the jury reached a verdict. Susan Smith was found guilty of 2 counts of murder. During sentencing, the court considered whether she should receive the death penalty. Ultimately, the jury decided on life imprisonment. Susan Smith was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for many years. She was sent to prison in South Carolina, where she remains today. But even decades later, the case continues to haunt people. One reason is the shocking betrayal at the center of the story. Children are supposed to be safest with their parents. That bond is built on trust and protection. In this case, that trust was completely destroyed. Another disturbing aspect was the false accusations Susan made about a black carjacker. It showed how dangerous false claims can be. Over the years, new details about Susan Smith's life in prison have occasionally surfaced. Reports describe disciplinary issues, controversial relationships with prison staff, and attempts to seek sympathy from the public. But none of those developments have changed the central truth of the case. 2 young boys lost their lives. Michael Smith was only 3 years old. Alexander Smith had not even reached his 2nd birthday. Their lives ended in the dark water of a quiet lake because the one person they trusted most decided they were in the way. It is a crime that still shocks people decades later. And perhaps the most chilling part of this story is the performance Susan Smith gave afterward. For 9 days, she stood in front of cameras and pretended to be a grieving mother. She cried. She begged for help. She asked the world to bring her sons home, all while knowing exactly where they were. But lies have a strange way of collapsing under their own weight. Investigators kept asking questions. They kept looking for answers. And eventually, the truth surfaced. The performance ended. The confession came. And the world learned that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not strangers hiding in the dark. Sometimes they are the ones standing in the light, asking for your sympathy. And even after the trial ended, the story did not simply disappear. The case of Susan Smith continued to raise difficult questions about psychology, manipulation, and how easily emotions can influence public perception. For many investigators, the most disturbing element was not only the crime itself, but the way Susan managed to convince millions of people that she was a grieving mother. During those 9 days when Michael Smith and Alexander Smith were missing, the entire country watched her interviews. People sent prayers, letters, and support. Communities organized searches. Volunteers spent hours looking for 2 boys who were already gone. Looking back, investigators later said that certain details felt strange. Susan sometimes showed emotion at moments that did not match the situation. At other times, she appeared calm when most parents would be in complete panic. Those small behavioral clues slowly helped detectives realize something was very wrong. The tragedy also deeply affected David Smith, the father of the 2 boys. During the search, he stood beside Susan, believing the same story that everyone else believed. He also pleaded publicly for the safe return of his sons. When the confession came, the emotional shock for him was unimaginable. Over the years, criminologists and psychologists have studied the case closely. They often point to it as an example of how deception can succeed temporarily when someone uses strong emotional performances. Susan Smith understood that the image of a desperate mother would immediately gain sympathy and support. But the truth eventually exposed the lie. Today, decades later, the memory of Michael and Alex still remains powerful. Their story is often discussed in criminal justice courses and documentaries, not only because of the crime itself, but because of the shocking manipulation that followed it. And perhaps that is the most haunting lesson of all. Sometimes the person asking for help is the one hiding the darkest secret. Even today, the case of Susan Smith remains one of the most disturbing examples of deception in criminal history. It reminds investigators to look beyond appearances. It reminds the public that emotion can be manufactured. And it reminds us how fragile the truth can seem when someone is determined to hide it. But eventually, the truth has a way of rising to the surface, just like the car at the bottom of that lake. And when it does, the reality can be far more horrifying than anyone imagined.